if we construe the vocabulary, talk of pain on the model of object and name, then the object drops out of consideration as irrelevant. But clearly, pain is not irrelevant to our talking about pain. So the problem here is thinking about pain as an object. We should not suppose that our vocabulary for sensation works on the same model as our vocabulary for spatiotemporal objects.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Michael Hymers. He is Munro Professor of Metaphysics at Dalhousie University in Canada, and his work is focused primarily on Wittgenstein, 20th century philosophy, epistemology, and philosophy of language. His books include Philosophy and its Epistemic Neuroses, Wittgenstein and the Practice of Philosophy, Wittgenstein on Sensation and Perception, and his most recent book or element with Cambridge Elements, Wittgenstein on Private Language, Sensation, and Perception. And this last one will be our focus for today, but he also has various published articles on these and related topics. But yeah, feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Hymers.
No, thanks for having me.
Great. So yeah, as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus today on your book with Cambridge Elements titled Wittgenstein on Private Language, Sensation, and Perception. And I'll include links to where people can find that from, well, Cambridge Elements or Amazon, I suppose, if it's there as well. But yeah, just to start off, I mean, could you give a bit of an overview of this element and what's it about? And yeah, just the topics you explore there.
Okay, so on the one hand, it's an examination of the history of the reception and interpretation of Wittgenstein's remarks on privacy and private language, which we find in philosophical investigations primarily, sections 243 to 315 roughly. But it's also an interpretation of those remarks, and it's an interpretation which argues that, as some other commentators have suggested, there's no such thing as the private language argument. I mean two things by this. First of all, that there's no one argument, as Peter Hacker has pointed out in these passages, that attempts to undermine our confidence in the possibility of a private language. Rather, there's an array of arguments and thought experiments and examples whose point is to, I think, try to shake the hold on us of a certain way of thinking about sensation and perception, and a related conception of what it would be to talk about sensation and perception. My grounds for saying this are that a lot of the arguments that we find in the investigations can be traced back to Wittgenstein's thoughts in the Big Typescript and the Blue Book and other work from the early 1930s. And there's an array of different sorts of arguments that we get there, rather than there being any one particular argument. The other reason for saying that there's no such thing as the private language argument is one that I take from interpreters like Jack Canfield, who want to say that there's no argument which is intended as a kind of decisive refutation of the very logical possibility of a private language. Instead, the kinds of arguments that we find here are intended, as I suggested earlier, to really sort of undermine our confidence in a certain picture of sensation and perception, and the sort of correlative way of talking about sensation and perception.
Yeah, perfect. So I just want a couple of sort of stage setting questions, I suppose. Could you talk a little bit about Wittgenstein's methodology? Like you mentioned how maybe he's not really trying to present some sort of knockdown decisive refutation or present, kind of theory that he's defending perhaps, but how it's meant to be sort of more therapeutic or clearing up confusions and how that might lead us to certain. So could you talk a bit about that and his methodology there?
Sure. So Wittgenstein makes a number of provocative remarks about philosophy and the nature of philosophical problems in the investigations. he describes them sometimes as being sort of sophisticated confusions that arise from not having what he calls an overview of the use of our words. He says that we're sometimes misled by certain analogies between forms of expression in different regions of our language. And so accordingly, he thinks that the goal is not to give, as it were, direct solutions to these problems by trying to present the best theory, but rather to try to escape the confusion. And the way to do that, he says, is to come up with a kind of surveyable representation, as it's sometimes translated, of the expressions that lead us into philosophical confusion. And he says, in conjunction with this, that if you do this well, then the philosophical problems will, he says, completely disappear, and we'll be able to break off philosophizing when we want to. Now, there are a number of different responses you might have to these kinds of remarks, and lots of readers of the investigations have decided, well, maybe we should just ignore them. So, for example, Kripke describes Wittgenstein as being cagey, and so tends to use that as a reason for not paying much attention to these concerns. Michael Dummett thinks that Wittgenstein's actual practice is inconsistent with these remarks, and so uses that as a reason to not pay much attention to them. And lots of other readers, I think, are struck by the possibility of there being interesting philosophical theories in the investigations, and they want to explore those. And so they think, well, that's inconsistent with paying too much attention to these remarks, so we're going to set them aside. But then there are lots of other readers who want to take them quite seriously. But there's a question, and that is, how do you take them seriously? What does it mean to do that? So Robert Fogelin, for example, suggested that we can find in Wittgenstein two different sorts of streams of thought, or two different attitudes. One is a kind of neo-Pyrrhonian attitude towards philosophy, which is skeptical about philosophy and really seeks to bring philosophy to an end once and for all. But there's also a kind of non-Pyrrhonian impulse that we find, and Fogelin says that this is Wittgenstein hoping to provide a kind of anti-foundationalist theory to replace the old foundationalist theory that he adhered to in the Tractatus. David Stern glosses this as saying that Wittgenstein, on this reading, is trying to do philosophy better rather than to stop doing philosophy. I like that remark, but I think that, once again, it admits of more than one interpretation. So we might ask ourselves, what is it to try to do philosophy better if you take seriously the thought that philosophical problems are sophisticated grammatical confusions, as Wittgenstein might say? Peter Hacker has one answer, which he's been advancing for many years, and that is to say that the task of philosophy is to engage in a certain sort of conceptual investigation, which is aimed at trying to discover what it makes sense to say, and exposing as nonsense those things that, well, of course, it doesn't make sense to say. That's quite consistent with the thought that Wittgenstein might be setting out to refute the very possibility of a private language on grounds that it simply makes no sense. So some critics of Hacker, like Stephen Mulhall and Gordon Baker, think that Hacker's view is too substantive, as Mulhall says. Baker says that we shouldn't think of Wittgenstein as trying to patrol the boundaries of sense. So the question then is what is he trying to do? I'm kind of taken with an analogy that he gives in a remark from 1931, where he says, you could think of philosophy in two different ways. Think of it as an infinite strip, and you could divide that strip lengthwise into problems that we've been trying to deal with since Plato and before, and which we'll go on trying to deal with, in the hope of getting better and better answers, but maybe never ever solving these problems. Or you could think of philosophy as being divided up crosswise into finite strips, and thinking of philosophy as the piecemeal activity of tackling one of these problems at a time, and once you've brought clarity to it, being able to say that that problem has basically been made to disappear once and for all. So rather than bringing an end to philosophy, you're trying to do philosophy in a better way, but it consists in trying to reorient the way we look at particular philosophical problems and try to dull our temptation to think about those problems in the ways that give rise to the sorts of confusions that Wittgenstein is concerned about.
Good. I think that's sort of helpful, but I mean, some of the things you say there, like, I don't know, I enjoy Wittgenstein. I mean, the name of the channel is actually based on line 109 from Philosophical Investigations, but I do find him difficult to decipher a lot of the time. And I don't know. So I guess I wanted to ask, like, first, what do you make of the difficulty there? And do you think it's still sort of worth trying to interpret him to get clarity on his positions and insights and stuff?
I'll take the second question first. I mean, I guess I would have to say, yes, I do. Otherwise, it's sort of mysterious what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so. Why do I think that it matters? I guess I have a certain sympathy for the thought that at least some of the problems that philosophers are preoccupied with are sophisticated kinds of confusion. I mean, Wittgenstein raises the question: why is it that we're still dealing with the same questions that Plato dealt with? And his response is that these questions are they're built into our language, and by which I take it to mean something like European languages, and they keep we keep getting led down the same paths over and over again, and without any prospect of actually solving these problems. Problems that have actual solutions, or problems that we find in the sciences, for example, they get solved, or at least we make progress on them, and we move on to something new. So there's a part of me that is sympathetic to that, I guess. The difficulty of reading Wittgenstein, of course, is I'm not sure if it's quite unique, but it's probably almost unique. I mean, there are some philosophers who are difficult to read because their prose style is exceptionally complicated and difficult. You think of Kant or Hegel, and others who just are spending a lot of time trying to make extremely subtle, sophisticated points, and so end up taking you into a lot of epicycles to try to understand what's going on, or who use a lot of technical terminology. And in lots of ways, Wittgenstein isn't like that at all. His prose is very, very simple, straightforward. He doesn't use a lot of technical terminology, though there is some, language games and so on. Part of what makes him difficult, I think, is that he defies the expectations that we tend to acquire in the course of learning to do philosophy. We expect him to be giving, theories that are going to provide, potential answers to these perennial problems that we're concerned with. Despite the fact that he tells us that he isn't doing that, it seems almost impossible to believe in a way, and so we tend to want to read those theories back into the text, and that's enabled by the fact that the Philosophical Investigations, in particular, is written as a kind of multi-voiced dialogue in which you find proposals being made that look an awful lot like traditional philosophical theories, and we latch onto those, and we want to sort of blow them up into a bigger theory, and we want to think that that's what Wittgenstein is up to, and then he says, no, that's not what I'm doing, and then we walk away feeling a bit perplexed. I think that the only remedy for this is to take seriously what he says, that he isn't attempting to give us complicated theories, but he is attempting to, I guess, bring us in by as it were, confessing his own temptations and getting us to recognize our temptations in the text. And that in a way is what makes the text at times therapeutic for the right kind of reader, I guess. That you sort of get to the point where you think, oh, right, I was being taken in by a certain analogy, and now that I look at that analogy, I see it's optional. It's not one that I necessarily have to accept, and so perhaps I don't have to think about this problem in that kind of way anymore.
Good. Okay, so we should get into. Well, I want to. We've been talking a little bit about the private language argument, but we should maybe explain and then explore that a bit more, I suppose. So, yeah, the first thing on what even is a private language seems to me a significant question, because I'll say, going into this, my sort of understanding of this argument was like, okay, he was giving some reason to think that a private language is impossible, or at least doesn't make sense in some way. And but then what a private language was is either it's meant to be something that's like a language that's only in fact understood by like one speaker or something like that, or one that's like in principle like incommunicable or something like that. And my thinking was like, okay, that former interpretation kind of seems implausible, or at least like the argument seems unsound to me. Like I think you could imagine something like that. And the latter interpretation, maybe it's correct, but it's almost like trivial, perhaps, depending on how we fill in those details. But anyway, and now I see that maybe this is not quite the right way to think about it. But what do you think about this sort of reaction to what he's written here about this, and like how would you prefer to think about what a private language is according to Wittgenstein?
I think that both of those ideas have a respectable genealogy in the literature on Wittgenstein. So there certainly have been lots of folks who have thought that when Wittgenstein is arguing against the possibility of a private language, if indeed that's exactly what he's doing, that would entail that, for example, there could be no such thing as a solitary language. So that, a kind of so-called Robinson Crusoe, who had been stranded as an infant on an island and raised by wolves and somehow developed a language, would be something that we couldn't really make good sense of. And so we can think of that as supposing that Wittgenstein is committed to the thesis that language is essentially social in the sense that it has to be spoken by more than one person. The alternative, which you also mentioned, is that to say that a language is private is to say that it could not possibly be shared with somebody else. I think that fits the text better. When he introduces the topic of a private language, he considers these other possibilities. Could there be people who spoke only in monologue, for example, but whom, if we could only study them closely enough, we might come to understand? He says, sure, that's not a problem. And of course, I can keep my thoughts private to myself. I can keep a private diary and all these sorts of things, in the sense that it's something that I don't share with anybody else. But the concern that he has, I think, is whether there could be a language that, by its very nature, could not be shared with another speaker. But there's a proviso here, and that is, some interpreters have been tempted to think that Wittgenstein is interested in, if you like, the idea of a private language for its own sake, so that we might think that a private language could have, any old subject matter at all. You find Strawson saying things like this in his very early review of the Investigations. But I take it that Wittgenstein's concern here is specifically with a language that we would use to describe our own sensations and perceptual experiences. And the worry about this is motivated by a certain way of thinking about sensation and perception, which I think he thinks leads us naturally into this, to entertain this possibility, outlandish though it may seem.
Yeah, and I did want to cover, that's definitely helpful, and we're going to get into that more. I did want to cover maybe some of the other, you discussed the different sort of waves of interpretation of Wittgenstein here. And like the first one that I've heard of this one before for sure, where people think that maybe he's offering a sort of skeptical argument that something to the effect of like, look, in order for us to have a private language in this way, where we like, I don't know, token experiences and so on, and fill in the meanings, we'd have to sort of know what we did previously, but perhaps we can't know that, or at least know that in the right sort of way. So it's a sort of memory skepticism sort of concern for a private language. Maybe I'm not explaining that very well, but what do you think about this interpretation of Wittgenstein here?
So this is an interpretation that arises very, very quickly after the publication of the Investigations in 1953. And it's an interpretation that's to be found in particular in the work of Norman Malcolm. And the thought here is that we should focus on section 258 of the Philosophical Investigations, which is where we find the diary example. So in this example, I'm to imagine myself having no sort of typical means of being able to express my sensation, by groaning or, clutching my elbow or crying out. But I am somehow supposed to formulate my own language for my sensations by focusing my attention on my sensation and then associating with it a particular sign, S. So that every time I have that sensation in the future, I can write S in my diary as an indication that I've had it. Now, what Malcolm seemed to be concerned about was that I might not. There's something peculiar about this sort of case, such that it would be questionable later on whether I could remember whether I was correctly, writing S in my diary or not, or whether I might somehow get confused about what sensation I had assigned S to. And critics of this view responded that, well, this just seems to be, first of all, it seems to be a verificationist argument. It seems to be saying, look, there couldn't be any meaningful use of the sign S because I couldn't verify whether I was using it correctly or not. And so if you are not sympathetic to verificationism about meaning, which more or less nobody is anymore, then you'll find this reading of the passage problematic. Additionally, it does seem to entail this kind of skepticism about memory. So a number of critics said, well, look, surely the same thing is true in my ordinary everyday language. If I call something a dog, what's to prevent me from forgetting the next time I see such a creature, whether that's a dog or something else? So the concern was that this kind of skepticism just generalized, and if the argument went through, then it would be impossible to speak a language at all. But since it's not, then obviously there's something wrong with this way of interpreting the argument. And but lots of both critics and defenders of Wittgenstein tried to sort of deal with this verificationist reading from basically about 1954 right through the 1960s. And with one or two exceptions, it isn't really until the 1970s that we find an alternative to this reading of the diary example being put forward.
Good. Yeah. I was going to bring up the diary example and some other examples later, but I guess that's good there. And so that's sort of first wave. You can think of that as sort of leading to a sort of memory skepticism or relying on that. But then, you mentioned the second wave also, which is, people thinking that the problem has to do with a certain sort of a sense of definition. So could you talk about that and how they think, it was like Kenny and Hacker and so on, taking this sort of approach?
Sure. I mean, so on this semantic reading of the diary example, and you find hints of this in Malcolm, in Rush Rees, in some other commentators, but it never really gets very well developed. Probably the earliest good development of it is by Les Holborough in a 1967 paper, which seems to have been largely forgotten over the years, but it's a pretty good paper. But it's really in the 1970s with the work of Anthony Kenny and Peter Hacker that this interpretation gets a lot of support. And the thought here is that we shouldn't see the argument as being an epistemic argument, one about whether or not I can know whether I have correctly written S in my diary or not. It's one about whether I have succeeded in giving a definition of the sign S by focusing my attention on this sensation. The motivation for thinking that I haven't on this reading is actually connected with the passage that immediately precedes the diary example, which is the example of the child genius in section 257. And in that passage, Wittgenstein invites us to imagine what it would be like if we had no external expression of a sensation. And then one of his interlocutors in this passage sort of says, well, imagine that there's this child genius who is able to formulate this language, and so gives a name to his own pain. And the response is something like, well, what exactly does this naming of pain consist in? In Anscombe's translation of this passage, we have Wittgenstein saying there's a lot of stage setting that goes into the naming of something if it's going to be possible to give a name to anything at all. Kenny and Hacker and Holbrook, I think, all rightly think that this is a reference to a much earlier section of the Investigations, running from about section 28 to section 38, in which Wittgenstein talks about ostensive definition, and basically says, look, if you're going to give an ostensive definition, then you have to deal with the problem of disambiguation. I can't just point at something and say a word and assume that I have given a definition for that word, because it's ambiguous whether I'm pointing to its shape, to its size, to its color, to the thing itself, to the number of things that are present, and so on. If I'm talking to somebody who already speaks my language, then of course I can easily disambiguate by saying, look at the color, or look at the shape, look at the size, and so on. If I'm trying to teach a word to a child, then I have to, I'm going to be in a position where I have to, teach the child to disambiguate. So, she has to bring me other things like this, for example, things of the same size, or things of the same color, or things of the same shape, and I correct her if necessary, or say, no, you've done a good job if she's done it the right way. And that's how we in practice disambiguate what it is we're pointing to. So what the child genius argument seems to suggest is that if we strip away all of our ordinary expressive behavior associated with, for example, being in pain, then there's nothing left that allows us to clearly disambiguate what it is we're talking about when we try to assign a private name to a sensation, and that on the Holbrook, Hacker, Kenny reading is carried into the diary example. So when I try to focus my attention on my sensation S and assign a name to it, it's indeterminate what I'm doing. Am I focusing on the sensation itself, on its duration, on its intensity, on its location? There's nothing in my merely concentrating my attention that succeeds in carrying out that disambiguation any more than there would be if I were just pointing to something and saying, dog.
Yeah. And this interpretation actually seems to be not too far off where you end up, although there's some important differences. So I guess we'll get to there, but maybe we should talk about the third wave first, which is maybe perhaps the most influential, because there we have the sort of rules and community interpretation. And most notably, you have Saul Kripke in his Wittgenstein on Rules in Private Language. And yeah, the rough idea is that he thinks that, or he argues that, well, actually, he argues for a stronger conclusion, but at the very least, it's not facts sort of internal to me or about me alone that can even fix meaning or whether I follow a certain rule or something like that. So he's sort of interpreting, as I understand it, Wittgenstein is suggesting that, well, language meaning and rule following has to be something social if it can't be something entirely individual, something like that. Is that right? And then what would you say?
It's along those lines. I mean, Kripke, of course, is it's a bit difficult to pin him down, because he says this is not my view, it's not Wittgenstein's view, it's Wittgenstein's view as it struck Kripke. And then he also wants to say that he's not arguing that community, for example, would ever render it determinate what rule I'm following. So he takes Wittgenstein to be giving a skeptical argument in the passages on rule following, the upshot of which is there is no fact of the matter about what rule I follow, and I just have to learn to live with that, as do the other members of my community. And the way we learn to live with that is just by judging that other people are doing what each of us would do. But there's never any fact of the matter, so there's no actual solution to the puzzle. In the course of giving that argument, Kripke says, that he thinks that this is the real private language argument. So he says the real private language argument takes place way back in sections 201 and 202 of the investigations, and the discussion, section 243 onwards, is just a particular application of it to the case of sensation language. As you say, this is a much discussed interpretation. The secondary literature on Kripke is enormous, but I take it that there are some problems with this as a reading of Wittgenstein. Never mind the sort of philosophical viability of it. I mean, for starters, a lot of the passages on private language that we and relatedly on the privacy of sensation and so on that we find in the investigations, a lot of the main arguments were formulated in the early to mid 1930s, before Wittgenstein became really interested in the rule following problem. I mean, you find hints of he first approaches the rule following problem in about 1935 in the Brown book, but it's really in 1937 and beyond that he gets really taken in by that problem. So it seems as though these arguments already had some kind of force for him before he turned to talking about rules. I mean, additionally, Kripke, he ignores this remark, which says that there's a way of following a rule or a way of grasping a rule that is not an interpretation, but which consists in, conforming to the rule or going against it in particular cases. And this seems to me to be an important remark for making sense of another remark that Kripke alights on, which is this suggestion that one cannot follow a rule privately. So that appears at section 202, I guess it is, of the investigations. And that looks an awful lot like the remark in section 258, the diary example, where some voice says, look, I have no criterion of correctness, so there's no way for me to apply the name S. But if we look at the original location of that remark, that one cannot follow a rule privately, in earlier drafts of the investigations, and I'm just reporting what Gordon Baker and Peter Hacker argued many years ago, we see that it was originally embedded in a discussion of whether or not when I am trying to make a judgment about whether I'm having a red sensation or an experience of redness at the moment, whether I have to first stop and identify the sensation and then make a judgment about whether it's red or not. And so the remark arises there. There's a way of following a rule that is not an interpretation, i.e., which does not consist in stopping to consider this sensation and then judge whether or not it is red. And following a rule without interpreting it just consists in making the judgment, saying, I have a red sensation or I'm seeing red. So that doesn't seem to have too much to do with being a member of a community. I'm judging whether or not my sensation is red. It's not as though I'm engaged in a kind of obviously engaged in a kind of public practice in the sense of being a communal practice. It may be public in the sense that it has to be understandable to other people, but it doesn't seem to require other speakers to do that. As well, a lot of the passages, when Wittgenstein talks about rule following being a practice or an institution or a custom, some interpreters have wanted to say, well, look, that shows that these are social things. But I think that it's, once again, as Baker and Hacker argue, it's not settled by, the ordinary use of those words in English or in German, the other German correlates, that he's talking about something that is communal. We have to look at how he himself actually makes use of these terms. So I think that there's just an abundance of textual evidence for thinking that this, the the leading idea of the third wave is really just not a very good interpretation of what Wittgenstein is on about when he's talking about privacy and private language.
Yeah. Do you think that Wittgenstein would be or would have been sort of sympathetic to many of the remarks that Kripke makes, or do you think he would have not?
I'm inclined to think not. I mean, Kripke takes him to be raising a skeptical puzzle. I suppose I would take him to, if I were going to give a cartoon sketch, it would be something like this. All those cases where Kripke has Wittgenstein arriving at a skeptical conclusion about how it can't be my intention, it can't be my past behavior, it can't be my disposition, and so on. That settles whether I'm doing addition or quaddition. That in all of those cases, really, what Wittgenstein is doing is saying, look, if you're looking for a theory of meaning, of rule following, then you're going to end up with these skeptical puzzles. But that just goes to show that meaning isn't the sort of thing that we ought to be so concerned about having a theory regarding. So it's the skepticism in a way is produced by the attempt to give a theory of meaning rather than being something that requires us to give a theory of meaning to alleviate.
Right. Okay, good. And then, so we could talk about the fourth wave, or I guess maybe it'd be maybe more helpful to introduce some or discuss at greater depth some distinctions that he makes. So, well, one of the key things that he discusses is this notion of like private objects, and he used the term super private as well. Can you just introduce what those are supposed to be according to Wittgenstein, and what is it to sort of objectify a sensation or perceptions?
Okay, so I think that there are two distinctions that it's worth making here. The first is a distinction between what we might call ordinary privacy and super privacy. So this term super privacy is used by Wittgenstein in his notes for the philosophical lecture that he was supposed to give in 1941, I guess it was. So if there's a sense in which, of course, my sensations can be said to be private. For example, if I conceal them from you. So if I'm in pain and I don't, express my pain, I don't report that I'm in pain, then that's a sense in which we could say that my pain is private. But that's consistent with saying, nonetheless, I could report it to you and you would understand what I was talking about. Whereas super privacy is the thought that somehow my sensations are, locked away in this kind of private inner space. And so there's no way that I can actually share them with you. I can't talk about them. I can't, only I can get access to them in some way. And it's clearly the latter kind of privacy, the super privacy that Wittgenstein is concerned with. Some commentators, I think, have overlooked this, going all the way back to Strawson, for example. And so they've been led to think that Wittgenstein is denying that we can talk about sensations, because he there are arguments that make it look as though he's denying that we can talk about super private objects. But a number of interpreters have drawn the conclusion that Wittgenstein thinks we can't talk about our own pain. So whatever we're doing when we use sensation language, it's got to be something else. We're talking about behavior, for example. So this tends to feed into a kind of behaviorist reading of Wittgenstein. So that's one distinction that I think we need to keep in mind. The other is a distinction between what we could call ontological privacy and epistemic privacy. Norman Malcolm calls this a distinction between the privacy of ownership and the privacy of observability. Anthony Kennedy calls it the distinction between inalienability and incommunicability. It's ontological, ontological privacy, or the privacy of ownership, that is first of interest to Wittgenstein, going all the way back to 1929. And in 1929, of course, he's busy trying to rethink his views after having encountered all sorts of difficulties for the Tractatus. And one of the things he's concerned about is the sense-datum theory of perception, which is a theory that in the hands of Moore and Russell and Broad and Price says that essentially sensations and perceptual experiences are objects of a sort that exist in a kind of phenomenal space. And so part of this picture seems to be, look, if I'm in pain, then I've got something in my private phenomenal space that you couldn't possibly have, because you've got no access to my private phenomenal space. So I'm the private owner of my pain. Wittgenstein responds to this very early on, late 1929, by saying, look, if nobody else can own my pain, then I can't own it either, given what we ordinarily mean by ownership. If you can't own my bicycle, then I can't own it either. Ownership over my bicycle seems to presuppose the possibility of it being owned by somebody else. Likewise, ownership over my pain ought to presuppose the possibility of somebody else owning it. And we're maybe in Russell's version of the sense datum theory, that's a possibility, because he seems to think that there are free-floating sensibilia, as he calls them. But generally speaking, it's not the sort of normal way of thinking about sense data. So that suggests that my sensations are not things that I have private ownership over. Why am I tempted to think that I do? Well, because I'm thinking of them as being like objects of some sort. And why am I tempted to think of them as being like objects? Well, says Wittgenstein, I have engaged in what he calls the objectification of my sensation. And that involves basically saying, look, I was in pain, so there must have been something that was painful when I had that painful sensation, when I experienced that pain, to put it more carefully. What I've done is I've taken a certain way of talking about pain. Notice that it's pain is a noun, and I've inferred that there has to be some object to which pain refers. And so there, this is one of those cases where I think Wittgenstein wants to say I'm misled by certain analogies between the grammar of different regions of my language. So I've got a noun here. In other places, when I talk about a coin, for example, there's an object that I'm referring to. So I think if there's a pain, then there must be a pain I'm referring to. That may seem naive, but when you look at the sense datum theory, it seems to be a perfect kind of example of that sort of inference. In the late 1920s, early 1930s, we find Wittgenstein attacking the sense datum theory and this sort of ontological privacy of sensations. One of the ways that he attacks it is by attacking the analogy of there being the kind of a space similar to what we think of as ordinary physical space. So he does this in two kinds of ways. So we might think of how the sense datum theory applies in the case of perception. So I might think if I look at a tree, then I have a sense datum of a tree, and that sense datum exists in my phenomenal space. And so it seems to be an object in that space. Wittgenstein says this analogy between phenomenal space and physical space is problematic. I mean, there are occasions on which it makes perfectly good sense to do this. If I'm in an art class, for example, and I'm learning to draw or to paint, then it makes perfectly good sense to focus on the lines and the shapes and the colors and to treat those as though they were objects in my visual space. But I shouldn't be misled by that into thinking that there are objects that have the same kinds of properties as physical objects have. For example, in visual space, nothing is at any distance away from me. So if I have an after image, I can't say that the after image is 3 meters away from me, 2 meters away from me, a kilometer away from me. None of that makes any sense. I mean, I could say any one of those as much as any of the other. There's no way to settle the question. So there's no fact of the matter about how far away my after image is. I don't have any position in visual space. My vision, my eye is sort of the limit of visual space. I'm not there in it, whereas I am in physical space. And very interestingly, whereas in physical space, we can say that a relationship like same length as is transitive, so that if you've got three things, A, B, and C, if A is the same length as B and B is the same length as C, then you can infer that A is the same length as C. That relationship breaks down in visual space. So if I draw a series of vertical line segments, gradually diminishing in size so that you can see that the first one is bigger than the last one. Nonetheless, it may be the case that any two adjacent ones look to be the same size. So if we're talking about how things are in visual space, we're talking about how they appear to me. So I'm going to say that first line segment appears to be the same length as the second one, which appears to be the same length as the third one. But then, and I'm going to say that for all of the line segments. But as a matter of fact, when I survey the whole collection of line segments, the first one is clearly going to be bigger than the last one. So transitivity breaks down for the relationship of same length as. So these are ways of saying, look, the visual space is not like physical space, and so you ought not to be so confident that our sensations are objects in visual space, or that our perceptual experiences are objects in visual space. There's another kind of example that he gives of a similar sort, but this pertains particularly to pain, and we find this in the Blue Book. So if I feel a pain in my hip, well, there are a number of ways I can sort of locate that pain. I can say, look, I just feel the pain in my hip. It has a location in pain space, if you want to call it that. Or I can point to it. I go to see my physiotherapist and say, here's where the pain is today. Or I can palpate it. I can press and see when it starts to hurt when I touch it. And ordinarily, those different indicators all go together. And so it's tempting to think that what I've got there is a kind of object, because I've got all these different indicators that are converging on its location. It's as though this is sort of analogous to what Aristotle calls the common sensibles, things that you can identify through touch and through sight and so on. And so you think that there's a unified object there. But Wittgenstein says somebody whose foot has been cut off may still feel pain in the foot. So it still has a location in pain space, but it doesn't have any location in physical space. It doesn't seem to have any location in visual space. I can't palpate and find the sensation. So these things come apart, and that makes pain sensations different from objects. So we shouldn't think of our sensations and our perceptual experiences as being objects. What's the alternative? Well, briefly, he suggests we might think of them as being more like qualities. So in that sense, it's possible for you and I to have the same pain, just in the same way as it's possible for my shirt to be the same color as your shirt. There's nothing puzzling about that, nothing difficult to understand. And all these puzzles about whether or not we can share the same pain seem to go away on that story.
Okay, so good. So there's a couple things I want to get clear on. First, there's this distinction between different sensations like pains and what we might talk about as like, I don't know, the elements in the sense data or something like that. Like maybe you have a sense data of like the Eiffel Tower, and there's a sense in which you might treat that as an object. But so as I understand it, Kripke's, Wittgenstein, and as you interpret him, he wants to reject that either are objects. So the pain itself is not an object, and the sort of object of the sense data is not an object either. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I mean, the sense we could say the sense datum theory of sensation and perception goes wrong by treating sensations and perceptual experiences as though they were objects. Right.
Yeah. I've part of this reminds me of, and maybe it's not a coincidence, like UT discussed a sort of issue regarding what we call the phenomenological fallacy. It was like, no, look, these, if there's a sense in which I'm having a perception of the Eiffel Tower, well, there's not literally this large metal structure in my mind, right? Because that's the sort of thing that the Eiffel Tower would be. So there's not things there that have the properties of the objects we suppose them to have in the real world. Not literally. I mean, you can, as a manner of speaking, to sort of talk about the sort of experience you're having, you might use those descriptions, but it might be helpful. You gave the example with the art thing to use these sort of descriptions to talk about our experiences and to make inferences and so on. But yeah, but that seems sort of broadly right to me, to think that, well, I don't think we shouldn't be taking this property talk and objectual talk when applied inwardly in this way too literally or too seriously. Maybe that's one way to think about it.
Yeah, that's right. And you're right, of course, but there are other, some of these kinds of arguments were sort of rediscovered a little bit later by people like Place and Armstrong as well, I believe.
Right. Okay, but I do have a bit of a worry just on the pain and the sensations not being objects. Like, it does seem a bit weird, because he does, of course, he wants to affirm that we have pains and sensations. So, like, mm-hmm. How do we make sense of this view that, like, well, they're not nothing, but they're sort of less than something, right? How does that make sense, perhaps?
Well, that of course is, makes reference to the discussion later on of the beetle in a box example. Not a something, but not a nothing either, and a number of interpreters have gotten quite exercised about that. But I think that if we think of pains on the model of qualities, are qualities something? Well, they're not things, but they're not nothing either. So if we take that as an alternative model for how we might think about sensation, then I think that we for starters, we make sense of that passage. It no longer seems quite so bizarre to say it's not a something but not a nothing either. Well, it's a quality, or like a quality, and I think that it allows us to capture pretty much anything we ordinarily want to say about our pain, and it makes sense of how we can talk about having the same pain, without it being sounding like our heads have been mushed together or something, and we're experiencing each other's consciousness. I'm not sure if that helps.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I think that's helpful. So, like, maybe to put it one way, would it be fair to say that on his view, sensations and experiences as qualities, they're like, in a way, they're sort of features of me. Like I'm in pain, but there's not like a thing that is the pain, or like an object that is that pain. Sure.
It's I think that's a reasonable way to put it. They're features of me. They're qualities of me, or qualities of my experience. I think that's a fair way to put it.
Right. Yeah, I could see people, maybe pushing back on different ways, like, well, but maybe this turns on how we are willing to use this sort of objectual language. Like, maybe, why not allow it for cases like this? People might think that qualities or aspects or things like that, or even processes are admit of an objectual description, but I don't know. It's not really.
I think that's a reasonable point, actually, and it's. It connects with part of the way I want to read Wittgenstein. I take him not to be saying, look, this way of thinking about pains as qualities is. I'm not saying that this is absolutely the right way to do it. I'm not saying that you can't think of pains as objects, but if you do, you've got baggage to carry, and you should own up to it. So there are these differences in the way that objects in phenomenal space have to be thought of, and unless you're willing to take on all those inconveniences, as it were, then it's you're better off just talking about objects as being, about pains as being qualities.
Good, and so then tying this to the private language concern, then for Wittgenstein, on your view, the problem with a private language is when it has to treat these sort of things as objects when they can't be so treated. Is that broadly right, or could you explain that a bit more?
That's one side of it. The other side is the side we've already talked about a bit, which is that right. in the situation where I'm imagining concentrating my attention on my sensation, I've stripped away the usual stage setting that we rely on when we're trying to disambiguate what I'm referring to when I assign a name. But I take it he wants to say that, in a way, this is why he bothers to talk about private language at all, I think, is that if you think of pains as being, or sensations generally as being objects of some sort, then it feels quite natural to apply a certain kind of language to them, to apply names to them, and to think that that you can talk about them in the same sort of way that you talk about ordinary spatiotemporal objects. So I think that's part of the attraction of the examples that we find in the case of the child genius and the diary example. That if we're thinking of pains as objects, then it seems like there's some sense in which I ought to be able to just focus on that object and assign a name to it.
Right. So how is this approach different from what you called like the second wave, the concern with the private ostensive definitions? Because it seems like it's sort of similar.
It's very similar. I want to say that the second wave has lots of important insights. Their focus on the child genius passage, which was basically neglected before that, and they're finding in the diary example at least something like what's going on in the case of the child genius. So my view differs partly because both Kenny and Hacker, for example, still want to say that this is an argument against the very logical possibility of a private language. Whereas I want to say it's something more like an argument that places the burden of proof on somebody who wants to say that you can develop a private language. So if the claim is something like, here's what we ordinarily think of as naming, what application does that have in this context? It's hard to see. Show me. It's not, of course, not meant to be a kind of an optimistic show me. The expectation is that it's going to be very difficult, if not to do this, and maybe it's never going to be done. But rather than being a kind of declaration that it's logically impossible to do this, and so saying that it's nonsense in the way that Hacker, for example, would want to say, this just says, look, so far you haven't told me what you can possibly mean when you talk about assigning a private name to your sensation. Additionally, what I want to say also is that this preoccupation with this concern that we shouldn't be treating sensations as objects is, I think, one that runs through much of the discussion that we find in sections 243 to 315. And so part of what I want to claim is that you can make good, coherent sense of how all that stuff fits together if you think of Wittgenstein as being especially concerned with this problem.
Yeah. What if someone just says in response, like, okay, look, I can have sensations and then I can sort of recognize that I have them and just token that sensation in a way? Like, why can't I construct a sort of language for talking about these private sensations in that way? Or would he allow that?
Well, I think that's the response is going to be, well, that you still haven't given an answer to the question of how you manage to disambiguate the reference of the term that you want to apply to the sensation. If you can tell a compelling story about that, well, then Wittgenstein will be all ears, as will I. But I think that as long as that argument is on the table, that kind of response is just going to be question vague.
Right, but so he's not saying that in principle it couldn't be done, but it's more like a concern or a challenge, is how you're putting it? Yeah,
but as I say, it's a kind of pessimistic challenge. The expectation is, it's going to be very surprising if anybody can give an answer to this request.
Right, and then you mentioned the beetle in a box example, and I mean, I think there's various others like in the vertex spectrum point, and I did want to ask about the so regarding pain. So like he talks about how, like, look, if we use that word without, and had in mind all the usual sort of symptoms, presuppositions, but still suppose that there were like these like different private things, that would be sort of like mechanically irrelevant to the language. Like it wouldn't make any difference to the language game, so to speak. But I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I could imagine someone responding that, well, maybe even if it would be irrelevant to the language game, they could still be different things. just as you could have like different gears playing the same role in some machine, perhaps. That's what I was thinking. So would he deny this, or I'm sort of under the impression that he might accept this, but I don't know. What do you think?
I'm tempted to say that the example you're giving is tacitly treating those gears and so on as being private objects that can't no reference can be made to in a way that anybody else could understand. And so the response is, well, has Wittgenstein demonstrated that that's impossible? No. Is there any good reason to suppose that there is any such thing? Well, it's not clear why we need to talk that way. It may be useful to mention that Wittgenstein does consider an alternative to understanding our pain vocabulary, our sensation vocabulary, but especially pain, and that is that when we learn to apply the term pain in the context of being taught to replace or supplement our natural expressions of pain with a certain vocabulary. So I fall and hurt my knee, I cry out, I clutch my knee. Those are all expressive behaviors, and adults gather around me and sort of take care of me, and then ask me, "Are you in pain? Does it hurt?" And I learn to say yes, and then I learn to say, "It hurts. I'm in pain. I've hurt my knee," and things like that. But there, the vocabulary is it's expressing the experience that I'm having. So I'm not, for example, conducting a kind of search inside my private phenomenal space to discover whether or not this object that I encounter is pain or something else, and then reporting, "Oh, I'm in pain." Rather, my expression here is a kind of spontaneous response to the experience that I'm having. We don't need the gears. We've got we've got a story about how our vocabulary for sensation hooks up with our sensations, hooks up with the experiences that we have. And it's only if we're thinking about those sensations tacitly or explicitly as super private objects or events or something, that we're going to be tempted to think that we got to have those. Otherwise, we somehow left out the most important thing.
Yeah, I guess the worry is that it feels like there should be, the worry is that it might seem like this approach is pushing him towards a sort of, almost like sort of behaviorism or something like that. And there's something you talk about in the element. I mean, how do you think he avoids going too far in that direction, do you think?
Well, he never denies that we have pain. He never denies that we feel pain. He never denies that we have any of these experiences. What he says is that we shouldn't think of them as being like objects. If we think of them as like objects, then, and this maybe here's a good point to talk about the beetle example. If we think of sensations as like private objects, then they drop out of the picture as irrelevant. So if we're thinking that the way that pain vocabulary functions is by my being able to pin a name on this private inner sensation, then everybody could have something different when I say I'm experiencing pain. So everybody could have something different in their box when they say they're talking about a beetle. But in as much as we manage to carry on a conversation about things, it seems as though that private object isn't playing any role. And so that you might think, oh no, that means that somehow pain has been torn out of here, and we're not actually talking about our sensations, we're just talking about our behavior. But there is the important proviso that Wittgenstein gives at the very end of that passage. He says, if we construe the vocabulary, talk of pain on the model of object and name, then the object drops out of consideration as irrelevant. But clearly, pain is not irrelevant to our talking about pain. So the problem here is thinking about pain as an object. We should not suppose that our vocabulary for sensation works on the same model as our vocabulary for spatiotemporal objects. And that's the source of the problem. So if we read that passage carefully, he's not sort of saying, look, pain doesn't matter for our sensation vocabulary. He's saying you who think that sensation vocabulary should be modeled on the vocabulary that we used to talk about spatiotemporal objects, you're the one who has a problem with pain, because it doesn't seem to play any role in your account of how it is we talk to each other. It's just this extra thing that is thrown in. Whereas on Wittgenstein's account, pain is what I express with my sensation vocabulary. So it's pain hasn't been gotten rid of. It's but we're thinking of pain as something more like a quality of my experience, and I express that without having to check in my box to see if there's something in there, and if so, what it is.
Okay, good. So two things there. One, how much different is it that it doesn't admit of the sort of objectual, object description? Because it seems like we could still ask, okay, but still on his view, we still have experiences. Does it not make sense to say that an experience with a different sort of quality, and I guess maybe it's difficult to express this in a way that you would find acceptable, but experience with a different quality could fill the same sort of functional role, so to speak. Like it could serve, it could lead to the same language practices and outward appearances and so on. Like, why couldn't we still ask that, even if we deny that it's an object per se? What do you think?
Well, I mean, that's saying, couldn't there be something private, whatever we want to call it, that is that each of us has, but which doesn't have to be the same thing in every case. And I think the response has to be, well, look, what are we talking about here? If we can't pick these things out, whatever they are, using our private language, then we can't talk about them. And if we can't talk about them, then we can't talk about them. There's nothing here to as it were, constitute the objection. I mean, a better way of putting it, I suppose, would be, it sounds to me like this is just falling back on the view that I take Wittgenstein to have already given arguments against. So unless those arguments are met, then I don't see how there's room for an appeal here to something that is that's playing the kind of role that you want it to play. I don't know if that sounds satisfying, or if you still feel like I'm not giving you what you want.
No, I think that's right. I mean, fair at least, but I don't know. It still might seem intuitive to a lot of people that, well, like take the inverted spectrum case, or just the view that when different people have look at the same thing under the same conditions, it might look to one person differently than to the other, even if all the language they use sort of lines up, so to speak. But I want to make sense. Intuitively, I think there actually would be a difference there in what experience they're having, even if it doesn't show up in the language that people use to talk about those experiences. Is that unacceptable to Wittgenstein, that we're treating this as?
Yeah, he's going to push back against this. So he's going to say, look, how do we ordinarily decide when somebody is seeing the color red? Well, we look at how they behave and what they say. So now somebody else behaves in exactly the same way, then that's the only reason we have for thinking that they see red. The inverted spectrum essentially works by saying, look, I'm going to take away the only reason we have for thinking that people see particular colors, and now sort of ask the question: isn't it possible that we might have different color experiences, even while we apply the same color terms? And I think Wittgenstein wants to say it's not as though once again it's not going to be a refutation of the very logical possibility of this view. But the question is going to be, why on earth would we think that this is a possibility, especially given the other arguments that we've considered that come up earlier in the text of the investigations.
Yeah, it's difficult. I was also thinking though about the beetle in the box type thing, or for the pain type thing. So what if someone were to say, okay, there actually is this sort of private thing, but it does sort of make a difference, or it is relevant in a way, because our normal discourse, our normal language, so to speak, for talking about pains and colors and so on, does sort of presuppose in a way that when you're using the term and I'm using the term, we have in mind, like, or we're having the same sort of experience. But us having the same sort of experience or not isn't fixed entirely by or only by details of the language, but is the actual fact about what the experience is in question, or the actual fact about what is in the box, so to speak. I'm sure this will not be acceptable to Wittgenstein, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, it depends on how we think about it, because of course we know that we do see colors differently. I'm partially colorblind, so I don't see colors the same way that lots of people do. We know that there are, even amongst people who have what we think of as normal color vision, there are tiny little differences in the way that they see color, which you can detect under laboratory conditions. So that's not a problem, precisely because it can be reflected in the way that we use our color vocabulary. It gives us if you like, a behavioral criterion for saying that we see these colors differently. The problem with the inverted spectrum is that no such discovery is supposed to be possible. There are these differences that allegedly these differences, and nothing in anybody's behavior or in any investigation we could ever carry out would reveal those differences. Everything would remain unchanged with respect to the way we behave and the way we talk about color, and that's the sticking point for Wittgenstein.
But would he be satisfied if, like, well, in principle, you could come to a further discovery, I don't know, maybe something about the brain or something that would reveal the difference there? Would that be acceptable, or would that not be the sort of thing?
It's an interesting thought. I mean, I suppose that would count as I don't see why he couldn't say that. I think he could agree with that. It's the undetectability of the difference that I think matters the most here. The story might have to be, his story might have to be made a little more sophisticated than it already is. But I don't think that there's an essential problem accommodating that kind of possibility, if we imagine it.
Okay. Yeah, and we don't have to get into broader, although somewhat connected, issues about mind, but, like, if somebody thought that minds were, like, you couldn't in principle investigate them in some other way because maybe they're like there's souls that are not part of the physical world or something, then maybe, but if they still thought that, like, you could have inverted spectra or something like that, then if on that view there'd be no in principle way to determine that difference there, then that would be unacceptable to him, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, you can think of it this way. If we go back to the case of the child genius and the case of the diary, in both of those cases, the beginning assumption is that we have stripped away all possibility of there being the normal behavioral expressions of pain or other sensations. And then the question is, can I nonetheless somehow determinately apply a term to some sensation that I have? and we've seen reasons for thinking that that's dubious. But in effect, in the case of the inverted spectrum, we're doing something similar. We're separating, we're driving a wedge between the alleged experience and the ordinary behavioral expressions of that experience, which involve, reporting what I'm seeing and responding in certain ways to differences in color and so on. So if those worries are worries in the case of pain and so on, then I think they're worries in the case of our talk about color sensations as well.
Good. Yeah. And then I guess still on pain and I guess other related sensations. So Wittgenstein would say that there's a sort of, well, because there's not this sort of additional step here, it's not like we can be wrong in a way about whether we're in pain. So could you comment on that, the sort of infallibility of this?
Right. Is infallibility the right word? I mean, there are weird cases. I have cold hands. I run them under hot water. What am I experiencing? I think the response is if I can't say for sure, then it's probably indeterminate what I'm experiencing. So it's not. I don't think that that's necessarily a problem for Wittgenstein. But the thought here, I guess, is that when I stub my toe, I don't have to sort of pause to consider whether it's pain or something else that I'm feeling. That seems absurd. My expression of my pain is spontaneous, and there doesn't seem to be any room for me to make a mistake there. So it can look as though we can make mistakes if we're thinking about pains once again as being these objects in a kind of private space, and then it seems as though, look, I have to check to see what's going on in there, and then I have to make a report. And either my checking or my reporting are both possible ways in which I could go wrong. And so suddenly that seems to open up the door for kinds of mistakes that I think the door is actually closed on in Wittgenstein's way of thinking about things. That said, that sort of expressive talk about our sensations is for Wittgenstein, if you like, the entry level way of thinking about sensation language. We do, of course, go on to learn to describe our sensations and to report them rather than merely expressing them. If I go to my doctor and say, look, I have this pain in my hip, it would be sort of strange for her to say, quit complaining, let me do my job. She takes that as a report. I'm trying to describe what my pain is like. So that's clearly part of our sensation vocabulary as well. Maybe it's possible there to misreport. I try to give a description of my pain, and afterwards I think, that wasn't really a very good description. Maybe I could have done a better job of what I wanted to say. But that's something that sort of enters the the language game after we're already competent at simply expressing our sensations.
Yeah, but to me it seems like, okay, regardless whether we think of pains as objects, either the pain occurs or it doesn't. Either you were in pain or you weren't. And my belief or judgment or expression that I'm in pain is a sort of judgment about that fact. And yeah, although maybe it's sort of implausible, like psychologically, that we'd be mistaken about it, it still seems at least coherent to suppose that on some occasions we are mistaken about it, because we just somehow come to that judgment that we were in pain when we're not. And to me, I don't know, pointing out that it's not like there was this additional step where we treat this thing as an object and then check it in some way, that maybe that would introduce another way in which we could be wrong in principle. But it doesn't seem to me to eliminate any possibility of error. Do you see what I'm getting at there, or like what do you think?
I mean, when you describe it as a judgment, I immediately want to say, well, that's a judgment is a sort of thing we make on the basis of examining the evidence, as it were. Whereas if it's an expression, there's no examination that goes on. There's just, it's spontaneous. It's Wittgenstein says at one point, it's forced from me. So this is not. It seems to me, it just seems extremely implausible to suppose that if I walk into a door at a good speed, that I might be mistaken about what I express. Now, I don't know. Maybe there are odd science fiction cases we could try to cook up here, but in terms of our ordinary use of sensation vocabulary, it seems to me that this picture is not unreasonable.
Yeah, I suppose what I have in mind is that, like, yeah, okay, at least in normal cases, like, because of the way these things work causally and like psychologically, it's just always, or at least almost always, it's going to be really obvious to us, what sort of experience we're having, at least on the broad level. I mean, maybe there might be fine distinctions and we disambiguate experiences that we might be less certain about. And so there I want to say, yeah, okay, maybe in all cases, like where we're in pain or not in pain, and we sort of have this expression of being in pain or not in pain, we're correct. I want to allow that it's at least possible, or it's at least conceivable that we're not, right? At least in some cases. But yeah. And I guess the thought is that between expression and judgment, I don't know, it's still some attitude we have, however we want to phrase it, I suppose, whether it's something that just judgment might imply that there's a sort of, I don't know, consideration phase or like checking phase or something like that. Maybe we don't want to say something like that. It's just something that sort of happens. You find yourself having that attitude or expression. Still, I don't know. We don't need to dwell on this, I guess, but it's just my intuition anyway is that it's at least conceivable. It's at least coherent to suppose that you have that sort of expression or attitude. And in some cases you're incorrect, but
let me give you this. I don't know if it will satisfy you, but I can imagine maybe a pathological case where I have some kind of psychological disorder that leads me to believe for whatever reason that I am frequently in pain, and so I go around giving expression to that apparent pain, but I'm in some on some deep level deluded about this. Maybe that's a possibility, but I'm not sure if that's the kind of case that you would be happy with.
Yeah, maybe. Although if the sort of, if it's systematic in a way where it's sort of like it's covering like all of our cases, then that might strain, well, whether it truly would count as or wouldn't count as pain in a relevant sense. But I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like, I could imagine, maybe just imagine the pathology starts at some point after the linguistic practice is already fully developed or adequately developed, just to avoid some of those concerns. But yeah, I don't know. We don't need to maybe dwell on that too much, but I find it interesting anyway. Yeah, okay. I do want to wrap up in a little bit, but I don't know. So what do you think what do you say are some of the main takeaways from this, from Wittgenstein that you want to take here? Like what are some of the main sort of upshots you think of his writing in this section?
I guess that the idea of a private language is something that we can't make very good sense of yet, at least. And there's probably no reason to think that we ever will. But I take him not to be claiming to have given a categorical refutation of its logical possibility. I take it that he, as I said, thinks that we shouldn't think of sensations and perceptual experiences on the model of objects. And I don't think that he's making any claims about language per se, although his arguments do involve reminding us that there is this sort of stage setting involved in the application of a name to something, and that stage setting seems to be removed in the context of trying to imagine a private ostensive definition of a sensation term. Those for me are I guess the most important points here.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I was just thinking. I was thinking about saying this earlier, but like, what if someone tried to push back on the claim that those things are sort of absent in the private phenomenal space or whatever, by saying that no, but I can sort of attend to some of those more specific features in a way that would be sufficient to develop a definition or a language there. What do you think about that? Or does that just be,
So you're thinking of a way of disambiguating the application of the sensation term?
Yeah. So like somehow we can, what if someone just says, maybe this would be objectionable to Wittgenstein, but like I can attend to just the sort of aspects I want to capture, even when looking inwardly. Yeah.
I think if somebody wants to insist on that and just, hold on to it for dear life, then so you say, I think will be the response. I can't do it. And it seems, unless you can give a kind of description of how that's possible, then it seems as though the burden of proof, as it were, hasn't really been discharged here. So it seems to me to be, that kind of response, I guess, was one of the first things that made me think maybe we shouldn't think of this as an attempt to try to give a categorical refutation, because it is always open to somebody to say that. They can say, look, I can do it by magic. That's logically possible, isn't it? Well, I guess so. So it seems as though that there can't be a refutation of the logical possibility here. But I think that if we read Wittgenstein the way I want to read him, then what we have here is a kind of demand for a better story about how that's supposed to work. And until we have it, then I think we get to say, I don't see any prospect of that happening.
All right, fair enough. All right, I do normally end with a kind of more general metaphilosophical question, so if that's all right. So, like, what do you think? What do you think is the value of philosophy? Why is philosophy worth doing? Perhaps do you think for you, or generally, or for society? What do you think? I know it's a broad question, but
it's, there are of course lots of answers to it. With me, partly it's I can't stop doing it, but that's not and I'm sure that's the same with a lot of other people who do philosophy. But it's maybe not a universal recommendation. It forces us to think about things in a careful way and to consider possibilities we might not otherwise consider. I think that's that expands our minds in ways. I think that although it may seem that the stuff we've been talking about today is pretty abstract and far removed from most people's everyday concerns, I'd be inclined to say that Wittgenstein is giving us a picture of human beings as accessible to each other. We're not shut up in our own little solipsistic worlds. We are connected with each other, and we can understand each other, and that's an important thing.
Fair enough. All right. Yeah, so I guess I'll draw the questions to a close there, but yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Professor Hymers, and writing this element and taking my questions and providing your commentary. It's been really nice having you on.
It's my pleasure. I hope it will be worth your time.